In the small, forgotten village of Gelor, Bihar, where cracked mud huts clung to the earth and hunger was an unwelcome guest in every home, lived a man named Dashrath Manjhi. Life for the poor in this rugged land was unforgiving. The fields yielded little, the rains betrayed often, and the towering mountain that loomed over the village felt like both a curse and a prison wall. To reach the nearest hospital or market, villagers were forced to walk for hours, climbing steep, jagged paths. For most, survival itself was the only dream they could afford. But for Dashrath, despite the poverty, there was one blessing that made every day worth living: his wife, Falguni. She was his anchor in the storms of hardship, the quiet comfort in the chaos of hunger and ridicule. Their hut, though made of mud walls and patched with straw, carried a warmth that no wealth could buy. When Dashrath returned from long hours of labor, bent with exhaustion, Falguni's smile had the power to make his weariness vanish. Together, they shared little, yet they felt rich in love. It was a sweltering afternoon, the sun blazing like fire over the land, when tragedy struck. Dashrath had been working in the fields, his body slick with sweat, while Falguni prepared food in their tiny hut. Wanting to ease his burden, she decided to carry the meal to him across the mountain path, a trail of sharp rocks and crumbling soil, a path the villagers feared but had no choice but to use. With a bundle balanced carefully, she set out, determined to bring her husband the comfort of a hot meal. But fate, cruel and unrelenting, waited on that path. Halfway across, her foot slipped on the jagged stone. She tumbled, her body striking against the unforgiving rock face, the bundle scattering into the dust. By the time Dashrath heard the frantic calls of nearby villagers and ran towards the mountain, his world had already begun to collapse. He reached her side, his hands trembling as he lifted her broken body. Her breaths were shallow, her eyes dimming, blood staining the dust beneath them. He cried out for help, begged the villagers to bring water, to fetch a doctor, but the hospital was miles away, beyond the mountain that stood between life and death. There was no time. In his arms, before his desperate eyes, Falguni slipped away, leaving him shattered in a silence heavier than the mountain itself. For Dashrath, that day the mountain was no longer just stone. It was a cruel wall that had stolen his wife, his happiness, and his reason to dream. The love of his life was gone, and in her absence, only grief and rage remained, grief that would soon fuel a vow the world would never forget. Friends, if this story touches your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks for more heartfelt tales. The days after Falguni's death were a blur of grief and emptiness for Dashrath. The once lively hut felt hollow without her gentle laughter, without the sound of her footsteps, without her presence to soften the harshness of poverty. Every corner of the home whispered her memory, every shadow reminded him of her absence. Nights stretched endlessly, his heart refusing to accept that she was gone forever. But amid the unbearable silence, a fire began to grow inside him, a fire of rage, of defiance, of a desperate love that refused to be buried with her. He knew the truth. Falguni had not died because of mere fate. She had died because the mountain stood in their way. That wall of stone, which the villagers had accepted as immovable, had robbed him of the woman he loved most. Dashrath's grief turned into a vow: if the mountain had taken his wife, then he would tear it apart with his own hands. The village, however, could not see his pain as he did. They saw only madness. When Dashrath took up a hammer and a chisel, standing at the base of the towering mountain, people laughed. "Look at him," they whispered, shaking their heads. "He's lost his mind. One man against the mountain. Impossible." Children jeered and ran behind him, mocking his strikes against the stone. Even his own relatives tried to pull him back, telling him he was wasting his life chasing a dream too big for one man. But Dashrath was unmoved. His hands blistered, his back bent under the sun, but he lifted his hammer again and again, each strike echoing like a cry of defiance. To the world, it looked like insanity. To him, it was love. With every chip of stone that flew from the mountain's face, he whispered silently to Falguni's memory, "This is for you. This is so no one else loses their life as I lost you." The first days were the hardest. The mountain seemed untouched, the rock unyielding. Hours of labor left only tiny cracks. His body screamed with pain, but his heart refused to stop. When he walked back to his hut at night, empty-handed and mocked by his neighbors, he would collapse onto the dirt floor, exhausted yet determined. He knew this path was not for days or months, it could take years, even a lifetime. Still, his vow was unshakable. Dashrath Manjhi had become, in the eyes of the villagers, a madman. But in truth, he was a grieving husband with a chisel in one hand and an unbreakable promise in his heart. And though the world laughed, the mountain had begun to hear him. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks slipped into months, yet the mountain still stood tall, unyielding, mocking the fragile hands that dared to challenge its centuries of defiance. Dashrath Manjhi, with nothing but a hammer, a chisel, and a heart filled with grief, labored day after day under the scorching sun. The villagers who once laughed at his madness soon grew bored of watching, but Dashrath never grew tired of his vow. Each strike was a prayer, each crack a whispered remembrance of Falguni, each fragment of falling rock a piece of the mountain surrendering to love. The work was merciless. His palms split open, his knuckles bled, and the skin on his back blistered beneath the unrelenting heat. His stomach often remained empty, for his meager earnings as a laborer could no longer support both survival and the tools he needed. Many nights, he went to bed with nothing but water to quiet his hunger. His clothes, once ragged, became tattered, his body grew lean, muscles strained and bones sharp beneath his skin. Yet even when weakness threatened to bring him to his knees, he forced himself back to the mountain at dawn. The seasons changed around him, but his resolve did not. In the summer, the heat baked the stones until they burned to the touch, yet he struck them anyway, sweat soaking his body like rain. In the monsoons, when the rains turned the soil into slippery mud and water streamed down the rocks, he struck still, his chisel echoing under the storm's roar. And in the winter, when bitter winds cut into his flesh and numbed his hands, he wrapped his palms in scraps of cloth and kept chipping away. But even the strongest hearts are not free from doubt. There were nights when he lay in his hut, his body trembling with exhaustion, staring at the ceiling of woven straw. He would wonder if the villagers had been right. Was he mad? Could one man truly bring down a mountain? Decades of life had already slipped through his hands, and all he had to show were a few broken stones and bleeding palms. The weight of loneliness pressed heavily upon him. Falguni was gone, his neighbors mocked him, and the mountain loomed endlessly before him. Yet in those darkest moments, when despair clawed at his spirit, he closed his eyes and remembered. He remembered her voice, soft and kind. He remembered her laughter, filling their little hut with joy. He remembered her last moments, the way her breath faltered as she lay dying in his arms because the mountain had stood between her and life. That memory alone became his strength. It told him that no matter how impossible the task seemed, he had no choice but to go on. And so, year after year, Dashrath struck the mountain. Alone, starving, mocked, and bruised, he refused to surrender. Slowly, painfully, impossibly, the cracks began to grow, and the stone that had once seemed eternal began to yield. The world had forgotten him, but the mountain was beginning to remember. 2 years passed, then 5, then 10. Dashrath Manjhi was no longer a young man when the mountain finally began to show signs of surrender. What had once seemed like an impossible dream now stood before the villagers in the form of a widening crack, a passage slowly carving its way through the heart of the stone. Where once his hammer struck against a wall that seemed unbreakable, now the rocks fell away more easily, their sharp edges piling into mounds at his feet. The impossible was shifting into reality. The villagers, who had once mocked him endlessly, began to pause when they passed by. At first, they whispered, still doubtful, still skeptical. "He has been at it for years," they muttered, "yet he still strikes every day." But curiosity soon replaced ridicule. They started to notice the change, a path that had not existed before, a space where once only stone stood tall. Slowly, laughter gave way to astonishment. People began to murmur among themselves. Perhaps this madman was not mad at all. For Dashrath, recognition mattered little. He still woke before dawn, his hammer slung across his shoulder, his body weary but his will as strong as ever. Each swing was still fueled by memory, each strike still carried the weight of love. His rhythm had become part of the land itself, stone breaking under steel, dust rising in clouds, sweat dripping into the soil. 20 years had passed since he began, yet his hands had never once stopped. And then, one day, the mountain gave way to light. Where once there was only shadow and wall, the chisel opened a gap wide enough for a man to pass through. Soon after, oxen carts could move across. Then bicycles. Then people began walking through the cut, shortening their journey by hours. What had once been a prison wall for the village had turned into a gateway of freedom. The distance to the nearest hospital, once a deadly 55 kilometers, now shrank to just 15. Children no longer had to risk climbing jagged paths to reach school. Women carrying loads of firewood could walk safely through. The sick and injured could be taken to doctors in time. The road was not only stone carved into a path, it was love carved into a lifeline. The villagers, mockery transformed into reverence. Men who once laughed at him now lowered their eyes with shame. Women who once pitied him now blessed him. Children who once chased him with jeers now ran through the passage he had carved, their laughter filling the air with new life. Dashrath, however, did not bask in their praise. He remained the same humble laborer, his heart still bound to the memory of Falguni. After 22 years of relentless toil, the mountain had finally yielded to a man's love and determination. What governments and machines could not achieve, a single grieving husband had done with his bare hands. The world had not yet heard his story, but his village had been reborn. When the final stones fell and the passage through the mountain stood open like a wound healed, Dashrath Manjhi did not raise his arms in triumph. He did not seek applause, nor did he boast of his achievement. Instead, he stood quietly at the mouth of the road, his hammer resting against the ground, his chest heaving with exhaustion, his eyes gazing at the path where the mountain once stood tall and unbroken. For him, this road was not a monument of glory but a grave marker of love, each rock broken in memory of the woman he had lost. But the world does not remain blind forever. News of his impossible achievement spread slowly, carried first by villagers to neighboring towns, then by travelers who marveled at the sight of the road carved by a single man's hands. Eventually, journalists, leaders, and filmmakers came to Gelor to witness what they had heard whispered, that one man, armed with nothing but primitive tools and indomitable love, had cut through a mountain over the course of 22 years. Dashrath Manjhi became known across India as the Mountain Man. He was invited to share his story, to sit among leaders and dignitaries, to be honored for his labor. Where once he was mocked as insane, now he was celebrated as extraordinary. But fame sat lightly on his shoulders. Dressed in his simple dhoti, walking barefoot, he remained the same man who once tilled the fields, the same man who ate whatever little he could earn, the same man who carried in his heart nothing but the memory of Falguni. Yet, recognition was not what moved him most. What truly gave him peace was the sight of children running freely through the path he had carved, women walking safely, and the sick being carried quickly to hospitals. He had turned his grief into a gift, his sorrow into salvation for generations yet unborn. For Dashrath, that was enough. In 2007, after living a life of poverty but leaving behind a legacy richer than gold, Dashrath Manjhi passed away. His final days were spent quietly, still humble, still simple, still bound to the earth that had both taken his love and given him his purpose. The government honored him with a state funeral, a gesture of respect for the man who had done what no one else dared to attempt. But even as people wept and praised him, those who knew his story best understood one thing clearly: Dashrath's road was not just a road through stone, it was a road through despair, through ridicule, through loneliness, carved only by love. Today, the path he cut still stands, traveled daily by villagers who no longer walk in fear of the mountain. His story continues to be told in schools, in films, in whispers of admiration across the world. It reminds us all that true greatness does not come from wealth or power, but from the courage to keep going when the world calls you mad, and the strength to turn personal pain into hope for others. Dashrath Manjhi's life ended, but his road lives on, a permanent testimony that even one broken-hearted man can move mountains. If this story moved you, please share it, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks for more stories of love, redemption, and hope.